I'm going to give you a 5-minute college about the research in brain systems and others about autism. So we certainly know that there is a lot of research that suggests early on the brains of children who develop autism grow at a more rapid rate. They, in fact, grow. It's sometimes referred to as an inflammation model of autism. If I could sort of use a kind of crude metaphor, remember that the first 2 to 3 years of life are a period of remarkable synaptic growth. There are 100 billion brain cells that we have, about the number of stars in the Milky Way, 100 billion, and they can connect with each other at the remarkable rate of 700 per second, meaning like a million a second brain wide. So the brain isn't a noun, it's a verb. It's always pulsing and grabbing things. Well, imagine if the brain is forming connections both horizontally in terms of integrating the hemispheres, but also cortically to subcortically. The systems below the brain, the cortex, the subcortical systems are connecting up and down. Imagine if, when that's happening, the brain keeps growing. I use the example of, imagine if you were painting a wall with a roller, and as you were painting the wall started stretching. Right? And there would be gaps, right? I think in some ways people, scientists are wondering, is there something that disrupts the connectedness that occurs in those? And this is, again, one image, so increased volume. Differences in the mirror neuron system. This is kind of speculative, and some of you may know about the mirror neuron system, and if you don't, I apologize. I won't go into that much, but it's a system that suggests when two people are engaging with each other, your brain resonates with my brain, similar to what Susan was referring to, and that if I touch my nose, even if you don't touch your nose, the parts of your brain that involve movement of your arm and finger and nose will activate. You'll see similar resonating. It's like your brain is mirroring my brain. That's based on some research that was discovered years ago by this Italian physiologist, Russian-born, named Giacomo Rizzolatti. I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain connectivity. That's a more recent set of findings I want to share with you. I also want to talk about differences in the limbic system. That's the subcortical system of our brain that really is involved in social processing and in activating of stress. And I think Susan had even mentioned the amygdala. Some of you may know the still face study, right, that Susan referred to. The researcher who did that was Ed Tronick up in Massachusetts. And he says that if you mention the word amygdala, people think you're a neuroscientist. So I am not a neuroscientist, but I do know a little bit about the amygdala. And then, of course, we have learned so much about the neurosensory processing differences. So I want to talk about the limbic system in those with autism and what we are learning. The limbic system for all of us serves as a social processor. It's connected at the core of your brain, the bottom of your brain. It sits there, and the organs that are involved include this organ called the amygdala I mentioned, which is this on each side of your brain, each hemisphere, this kind of little almond-shaped organ that is active from birth. And depending on what happens in your brain, that activates a whole cascade of impulses that prepares you either to activate your fight, flight, or freeze system, or it chooses not to if it's determined that things are safe and that everything is okay. So the amygdala is actually a very pivotal organ in terms of processing situations. And again, if you were to look at this picture, I can look on this side, you can see the amygdala is here, and it lays right above another organ called the hippocampus. So I'm going to talk about those two mostly. And some of you may know the hippocampus is implicated in processing experiences for short-term and long-term memory. There's been a lot of recent research about hippocampal functioning in those with memory problems. And by the way, Daniel Siegel, who does a lot of work in interpersonal neuropsychology, reported, I never knew this, so it's in his book Mindsight. He was talking about how the hippocampus really changes in size based on your work, based on your real experiences. And he said, guess which profession has a fairly large hippocampus? Yeah, see, you know that. Taxi drivers. Taxi drivers, so size matters for taxi drivers in terms of their hippocampus. So the idea that the hippocampus is important. So the amygdala processes a moment and processes that moment in a multisensory way through all of their sensory systems, right? And if that moment feels safe, it sends kind of a message to the hippocampus that says, all right, you see this set of neurons firing and this sensory experience and that person's face and the way they smell and the way they touch and all that, they are safe. So next time you see them, hippocampus, remind me not to get so crazy. Remind me as an amygdala to just be calm and enjoy myself, right? However, if it's a dangerous situation, the amygdala will say, oh, remember this one. And the next time you see this experience, send my signal to the brain, to the hypothalamus, to the pituitary gland, to the adrenal glands, the HPA system, to really get me out of here, to run. And if I can't run, help me fight. And if I can't, like that animal, play dead, if I can't get out of the situation. So these are real experiences. Well, it turns out that the hippocampus in children with autism seem, when they are younger, to be larger compared with the control group. And in fact, what's strange is that as the children got older, their size of their amygdala was actually growing in proportion to their social network. So people who are kind of gregarious, social, have a big Facebook following. Facebook is not the thing. Interpersonal following, their amygdala. So in some sense, what they think is happening, that increased size of the amygdala early on, and then impairments later on, where the amygdala seems to shrink in children with autism, might mean that they are in front end and later struggling. So what the interpretation is, that if the amygdala grows quickly in childhood, it may in fact lead to a more rigorous, robust stress response. Now, for years, we have talked about a comorbid condition in autism of anxiety, right? You've maybe heard that. I think it may be that anxiety is not a coexisting disorder. It's fundamental to what autism is. It's a primary diagnosis, not a comorbidity. And then, by the way, it may be that when they are younger and they are more anxious, more responsive, their behavior is more dysregulated, they are more dysregulated. And then as they age, their amygdala may be shrinking, meaning their social engagement remains difficult, their social processing is difficult. And so we certainly have to look at the idea that maybe brain systems, and this is just one illustration of the brain system, that social fear may initially trigger this hyperactive response because the amygdala is enlarged, and that eventually can give way to, in some sense, a shrinking of the amygdala, which makes it even less available for social engagement. Now, by the way, this is a finding that needs to be replicated and replicated, but the idea that maybe what we're seeing in terms of anxiety and distance and running and dysregulation and movement is not a behavior problem. It's a reflection of this fundamental response that the brain is having to the world. Imagine if we interpret it as a behavior problem and then socially require the child to behave in ways that are fighting against his wish to be adaptive, to run, to do whatever has to be done to help themselves. It can make, in fact, that attempted adaptation even more difficult.